Johar and welcome to the 11th session of the online series Deadline or Death Sentence, State Violence and Indigenous Adivasi Peoples' Resistance in India. My name is Lotika Singha, and I am speaking on behalf of International Solidarity for Academic Freedom in India. This series is organized by diaspora networks in solidarity with Adivasi struggles in India. I will moderate today's session, which is titled Resisting State Narratives, Normalising Militarized Mining and Displacement in Adivasi Regions, and it is my honor to introduce our speakers. Shahd Hammouri, an academic and international lawyer, Sharanya Nayak, solidarity worker with Indigenous Peoples movements, and Clifton D. Rosario, General Secretary of the All India Lawyers Association for Justice. Before I invite them to speak, in the light of recent developments, I will recap some key points that our series has been highlighting. Over the last 2 years, the Indian government, led by the Bharatiya Janata Party, has intensified the militarization of the mineral-rich forests that are home to millions of indigenous Adivasi peoples. This militarization isn't incidental. It's facilitating a vast public-private program of deforestation, extraction, and displacement in the name of development, a project presented to the wider public as the foundation of a Naya Bharat, a new India, something that all previous governments failed to deliver. At the core of this project lies the declared annihilation of the Communist Party of India Maoist and its armed wing, the People's Liberation Guerrilla Army. Accordingly, an escalated counterinsurgency program, widely referred to as Operation Kagar, was launched in January 2024 with the explicit goal of making India Maoist-free by 31st March 2026. Just 2 weeks ago, the Home Minister Amit Shah announced in the Parliament that this objective has been achieved through the weakening of the armed Maoist movement. The Maoist movement that took root in the Adivasi regions of Bastar in the 1980s has long posed a challenge to the interests of private capital. Its earliest interventions, like securing better prices for tendu-leaf collectors, redistributing land, or giving rise to one of the world's largest women's movements, are now systematically erased from the dominant narrative about the movement. Rather, the dominant narrative is that the Maoists have prevented development in regions like Bastar, particularly by obstructing mining. This narrative operates in a very specific way. It demonizes insurgent violence in language designed to produce fear, while simultaneously it turns state violence into something necessary, even desirable. Killings are sanitized as neutralizations, with monetary rewards to the state forces mentioned as casually as routine procedures. Extrajudicial violence has become normalized as governance. In other words, militarization isn't being rolled back now, but is being institutionalized. The security camps remain. Public services are delivered through or around these camps. Surveillance of everyday life in Bastar has intensified. So, is the declaration of resolution of the Maoist problem as a cause of underdevelopment laced with deeper meanings? Is it more about the state securing a monopoly over violence in order to clear the ground for extraction? What we've learned through the series and developments on the ground indicate that the declaration of victory appears to be about dismantling the conditions under which any type of resistance to land grab and extraction can exist. More fundamentally, it appears like a decisive assault on the long history of Adivasi political existence itself. To understand this, it's important to recognize who is at the center of all this. From the Adivasi agrarian struggles of the 1700s, when Tilka Manjhi struck down Augustus Cleveland, the Britisher leading the colonization of the Ramgarh hill tracts, to Birsa Munda's call for an unending revolution or Ulgulan in 1895, and the Bhumkan rebellion led by Gundasur in Bastar in 1910, Adivasi communities have consistently confronted forms of colonial and extractive power. These struggles led to some recognition and constitutional protections for Adivasi land and governance, but were only partially implemented. Thus, the Maoist emphasis on land distribution, forest rights, and resistance to exploitation found resonance with many Adivasi men and women from communities shaped by decades of dispossession due to broken constitutional promises and state violence. Think about the Salva Judum in the early 2000s. For these Adivasis, the Maoist or Naxal movement, as it is also called, became a space of organizational strength and interconnected strategies to resist that long-standing dispossession. The evidence is before us. Since January 2024, the overwhelming majority of the more than 550 people killed in Bastar alone are Adivasis. So too are those who have surrendered. And those recruited into state-backed forces such as the District Reserve Guard and Bastar fighters in a situation of otherwise high unemployment. The villagers being detained, beaten, or tortured by the state for merely demanding their constitutional rights are also mostly Adivasis. A simultaneous development, which we covered in detail in webinar 6, is the cementing of the idea that dissent itself is a threat to public security. This includes first the criminalisation and repression of the recently emerging civil mobilizations in Bastar. Between 2021 and 2024, tens of thousands of Adivasi villagers participated in prolonged youth-led mass protests, including the largest mobilization under the banner of the Mulvasi Bachao Manch, to assert their rights to land, livelihood, and dignity. These movements have been systematically dismantled through arrests, criminalization, and use of terrorism charges against the youth organizers. Second is the widening use of the label urban Naxal from those associated with Adivasi struggles to students, workers, farmers, and activists across the country. Recent actions, such as preventing reapplication for bail before 12 months by student activists in prison for challenging citizenship amendments seeking to marginalize India's Muslims, and Delhi police special units, actions of arbitrary detention, sexual violence, custodial abuse, and intimidation of student, labor, and anti-displacement youth activists suggests a broader effort to silence dissent across multiple fronts. And this is not just happening in Bastar and India. Across the world, while the contexts are distinct, there are clear structural resonances. From the Adivasi regions in India to Palestine and beyond, across continents from Sudan to Cuba, land sovereignty and political existence itself are at stake. And resistance is being met with overwhelming force, global complicity, and blatant impunity. The language of deadlines, of decisive victories, and of solving long-standing problems reflects a broader political moment, one that finds resonance globally, including in figures such as Donald Trump. In that sense, Amit Shah's declaration marks something distinctly Trumpian, we argue. So, how should we be navigating this moment? And what does it demand from those who seek to stand in solidarity with indigenous struggles? Our three speakers today, whose work engages critically with questions of law, resistance, and solidarity, will help us think through these questions from different but deeply connected contexts. I now invite Shahd to speak from a Palestinian perspective. Shahd, you serve as a senior legal consultant at Law for Palestine and fellow at Al Haq, and work on corporate accountability and corporate profiteering in war and critical international legal theory. Most recently, you have acted as legal consultant on the ICJ advisory opinion on the legality of the Israeli occupation of Palestine. Over to you, and thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you for inviting me, and it is indeed an honor and a privilege to be able to stand in here today with you in solidarity. And also, thank you for creating those spaces where we're able to bridge together and understand, as you kindly noted in your wonderful introduction, the structural causes that shape our realities and more or less create that clear bridge from the Adivasi struggle to the Palestinian struggle to the struggle of subjugated peoples all across the world, really. At the heart of this story is a global economic system that is premised on accumulation and dispossession. And what we find is a normalization of this idea that inevitably the interests of business as well as the accumulation of profit will always override people's right of self-determination as well as sovereignty over natural resources. Sadly enough, the story has been in the making, at least in its contemporary form, ever since the Second World War. I can hear my echo if anyone. Yeah, thank you so much. So And that story really has reached a point of utter insanity at the moment that we see and speak of. And the idea that development would be sold as stability or pacification as security are spaces where the legal language is used in order to also distort reality and also facilitate coercion against the local people. And we see that on a larger level of international legal discourse, as well as on a national level, where the notions of peace, stability, security are used to the exact opposite of that purpose. And indeed, it is the stability and security of the big corporations such as Adani and Tata who would be benefiting from the extraction of natural resources from this densely rich area. So, and sadly enough, again, that this is a pattern that we see Congo, Sudan, and indeed in Palestine. If you remember a few months ago, or even maybe over a year ago, there was the unforgettable statement by Jared Kushner, who noted how he dreams of the Gaza Riviera, as well as seeing the Gaza Board of Peace come in to us with the hyper business understanding of one of the most let's say, violent spaces we in on Earth, and that is Gaza. Instead of imagining accountability and justice, what we were greeted with was a mass capital coming in and to exploit us, and our only destiny, instead of that being as people who live in dignity, of being the cheap labor under which those companies would thrive. And indeed, as we can see in the case of India across generations, really, this has been a repetitive story. And as I started telling the panel when I first came in, my first experience going to India was actually seeing how that displacement happened to the people in Munnar with the tea plantations, and looking at the indigenous people there who now live in encampments, and the immigrant workers from Tamil Nadu coming in to work as cheap labor. And that is what we call a form of entangled accumulation. By that, the act of war or the use of violence, either by states or by foreign powers, in the case of Palestine, is the point of that is to cut the relationship between the workers and the people and their land or their means of income. And by that, you create the initial act of dispossession, thereby lowering the cost of expropriating their natural resources as well as exploiting these people and rendering them without a land, without a claim, and without means to organize themselves. In Gaza, we see that, and in Palestine more generally, we see that happening ever since the start of the Zionist project in the region, and that is around the 1930s. Sorry, the 1930s or late 19th century, to be more accurate. And with that came that notion of the destruction of the pre-existing forms of living, as well as the criminalization of all forms of resistance. And it's a very tricky and intricate change of framework. Rather than engaging with those people as people who claim self-determination, instead they are seen as militant groups of outlaws and quote unquote terrorists. So that's more or less one of the, let's say, the most classical spaces of narration. So Palestinians have been called terrorists ever since the late 19th century in the space of seeking to defend their own land and call for proper self-determination. And we can see indeed how little by little the corporate interest was indeed a core basis of the building of Israel. If we read Herzl's initial writings, and Herzl was the one of the founders of the Zionist school of thought, so to speak. In his book, The Jewish State, he talks about the colonial corporation specifically as a mode of expropriating the local, expropriating and facilitating the dispossession of the local indigenous population. And indeed, we can see that in the creation of the Silicon Valley of the Middle East, that being Tel Aviv, years and decades following that. So, and it's indeed quite wrong not to understand Israel as a part of this larger system. It is a microcosm, and it's also a very important outpost of both imperial as well as capitalist interest in a very oil-rich region. So while this struggle for Palestine doesn't directly sound as a struggle that is so deeply interconnected with oil, but for those who have studied this from a long durée perspective, what it would be very clear is that Israel's role in the region as a whole has been to deter calls for self-determination and sovereignty over natural resources by the people of the region, and to facilitate the rule of the elite in the region as well. So while we see, for example, with Gulf states, with Jordan, with neighboring states, as well as with Egypt and whatnot, while we see that on paper these places do have a sovereign ruling, in reality they are predominantly ruled by a very tiny elite, and that tiny elite functions on a very dependent narrative, as well as one that is lacking in sovereignty and independence in decision making, thereby subjugated to something more than that. So the case of Palestine is one where we're able to see a very deeply integrated form of violence that spreads like a cancer across the region, and that violence is deeply interconnected with the interest of capital as well as extraction and dispossession in the region, symbolized in a settler colonial entity, but then also the influence and logic of that. And sadly enough, the logic and influence of that is really appealing to the elites in the region. And along that line, claims for self-determination are then distorted. And instead of speaking of self-determination, we are always faced with a narrative of defense and security. And instead of speaking of sovereignty over natural resources, we are then met with the most suspicious forms of understanding of what development is. And if we are to uphold a harmonized reading of international law, if we are to respect the histories of struggle of people who have fought against colonization across generations, then we would have a very different reading and understanding of the law that does not distort or can be used or cannot be used coercively against the people. What do I mean by that? In the 1960s and 70s, in the moment of a mass decolonization by states, we wouldn't call it even decolonization, but mass moves of creation of new states and independence. These states are never independent as we speak, they're neo-colonial states. However, there was a big movement at the United Nations to create alternative philosophy of international law, one where international peace and security is premised on structural economic equality. And that is the translation of other political projects into the philosophy of international law and the language of justice, in the sense that there is no peace in this world unless we are able to share what this world gives us in the most equitable way possible. And for example, we would have people like Thomas Sankara would argue and tell us that in our fight for economic equality, we are fighters for peace, because there's no peace without justice. And that form of thinking, that different philosophy of international law, can be found in the Declaration of Friendly Relations, as well as the new international economic order that put the right of self-determination and sovereignty over natural resources and self-determination for peoples, not just for states. And there, of course, I would also refer people to the Algeria Charter that was very much, that had very strong language in relation to differentiating what is it that we mean by self-determination of peoples, rather than just simply within the state understanding, which in of itself, how we understand the contemporary state, is also something that we inherited from colonial times. So that alternative reading of international law, in a sense that tries to go against the current most prevalent understanding of international law, which is peace and security is the status quo, is upholding the power of the transnational elite class, as B.S. Chimney calls them, at all costs possible, and the equilibrium of power for them under that status quo. And that is the logic with which we see the Indian state operate. The peace for it is upholding the status quo of the ruling elite and facilitating their interest to that, and as well as, of course, the corporations that are affiliated with them, as well as the foreign interests that are affiliated with them, rather than the self-determination of the local peoples and maintaining what is it in it for them. So where are we now in a moment? So as we are speaking, I've been really trying to conceptualize this, and I deeply believe in the idea and the understanding that the world order is changing. The what is happening now with the US is a sign of decline. What is happening with Israel is a sign of decline. After these powers have shed away the mask of liberalism, the mask of, even though they're not adhering to international law, however, they did try to justify their actions by claims to moral superiority. They did try to uphold that facade of even argumentation along the lines of development as stability or pacification as security, but they've reached a point of so much violence, so much contradiction, and indeed, with the genocide, we've crossed a threshold of no return, a threshold where those masks are off, and also a historical threshold that we are reminded of as an inevitability, which is any power in the world reaches a peak and then falls after that peak. There is no never ending accumulation, even though, of course, war feeds never ending accumulation. There has to be a point of rescending, and there has to be a point of decline. And when your head of state is posting pictures of himself as Jesus Christ and entering wars that are that cannot be justified under whichever banner, and threatens to bomb a whole civilization and kill it, then that is definitely a clear sign of the fact that you have lost the plot and you're a dying empire. And of course, for someone who, is Palestinian and who comes from the region that has been most kind of hurt by the whip of empire in the past 100 years, really over 5 generations, the story of my family is that. And I'm sure it's very much similar for the Adivasi people, as well as other peoples who are in the same struggle. We also see and articulate this as a deep moment of a dawn of something new. We will be bearing the pain and the violence of this moment on our bodies, on our families' bodies, as we see it in Lebanon now, where Israel is taking the Gaza doctrine after it crossed the threshold of a genocide without accountability. It is normalized the targeting of hospitals and everything. After it crossed that threshold and entered into complete sadistic violence against the people, the local people, we still see beyond that. And we see that while this is the darkest moment before dawn, we are closest to a dawn of a new world order. We do not know what that world order will look like. We do not know how it will be shaped, but we know that the current struggles and the current voices will shape how that dawn of a new movement will look like. And indeed, if peoples are to rise or to take advantage of those shifts in tectonic shifts in the global world order, we must be organized, and we must be capable of understanding what is the global value system that brings us together and to be able to verbalize it. I would argue that this still has not been really done on a global level before, because we've never been so connected with each other. We've never, first of all, been so globalized, but also our pain our capacity to articulate how our pain comes from exactly the same source, which is this exact mentality of the accumulation of capital leading to these forms of destruction as and entangled accumulation as to enable the expansion of capital and upholding the status quo. That is kind of the same domination that shapes our struggles. And as one of my, I always cite this piece of, it's a rap song by one of my favorite Lebanese rappers. His name is Arras, and he says, you have united us in our pain and made a people out of us." And in that, they've made a global class of people who are the global majority, really, because the people can recognize that the global majority can now recognize the shared value system that brings us together. And we need to fill a vacuum of movement creation for the moment coming forward. Because if we've learned any lesson before, is that any movements need to have a clear path of how is it that we would bring these things together. And I think that at this moment, looking back at those moments of the 1960s and 70s and learning the lessons that were given to us with blood and gore from the people who fought against colonization and subjugation and the power of the transnational elite class, of how is it that we'd be able to structure our calls for self-determination and sovereignty over natural resources all the way from Adivasi to Gaza. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shahad. To try to summarize what you spoke in two sentences would not do justice, and I think we will be listening to your talk again and again. And the way you have linked, brought the global context, brought Buster to the global context, and linked, yeah. Thank you so much. I'm going to pass over to Sharanya now. Sharanya, you've been part of fact-finding missions, people's tribunals, research on militarization of Adivasi territories and sexual violence as a tool of state repression, fighting against forced evictions for conservation projects, dams and extractive mines, as well as intergenerational learning and cultural work. All this you've done as part of your solidarity work with Adivasi communities in multiple regions. Over to you, Sharanya.
Johar, everyone. So, and thank you, Lotika and Insaf, for giving me this opportunity to share. Uh, I'm like from Shahd to me, it's like from the global to literally the local. My experiences have been very limited to the southern regions of Odisha and Bastar. I want to start like when Lotika told me about this session and was like it's more about the solidarity that we as a non-Adivasi people can, what kind of solidarity we can offer to the Adivasi communities. The first thing that came into my mind was Asata Shakur's line, which says that the rage of the oppressed is never the same as the rage of the privileged. And today, actually, I want to share about the rage of the privileged and the caste, class, the upper caste, upper class backgrounds to which that we are born into. But starting with that, I want to consciously acknowledge that this is the historic baggage that we carry, and we take the responsibility to challenge it at every level. Through this journey, through my long journey of which still continues, of working with Adivasi, Dalit, Moolvasi communities and the resistances, I learned about the complexities of what I very initially, very casually would refer to as solidarity. But as I worked, I started understanding the complexities of what solidarity work really means. And I painstakingly was actually taught by the people that the first way or one way of being in solidarity with them, with the people, is actually through a long journey of critical self-reflection, arduous unlearning of all the baggages that we carry from the caste backgrounds that we are born into, the formal education that the indoctrination that comes through formal education, and also like life-changing relearning. If we do not rewire, decolonize our minds, and we relentless practice of what we learn from communities, Unless we do that, that's also, I believe, and what I understood is part of solidarity work, working on ourselves. The other way is obviously to stand with the people, to share the physical spaces of resistance, and to challenge the power of a violent nation state. And in this form is when we, as the outliers of the community, of a community that is resisting, we are on the outlying nations. We really would need to strive past our caste, class, gender, locational privileges if we have to talk of solidarity. Continuing to enjoy, live with those privileges, and talking of solidarity is not something that really comes from a decolonized position. And the third way that I learned of working in solidarity with Adivasi resistance was by working under the leadership of Adivasi movements and to learn to use the skills that our privileges have actually been able to give us on the directions of the leaders. And it is in this space, this third space of learning to work on under Adivasi leadership that I see the maximum struggle, the most virulent and disturbing power struggles between people with power and people with privileges. And that was my, a lot of my learning comes from this third form of solidarity work. And so when I learned, that whatever solidarity work we do, we have to first decolonize our minds, our bodies, our actions, our relationships. And only then can we actually talk about this work as solidarity. And that, if not, otherwise, it's almost like acts of helpfulness, bordering sometimes on patronizing salvage, actually. And so the solidarity work starts with actually being able to internalize and acknowledge that the Adivasi ways of life and living are the foundations of Adivasi nationhood. And that self determination, autonomy, liberation, and sovereignty are integral to Adivasi nations, which have existed from long before the genesis of the modern Indian nation state or any other nation state, very rightly pointed out by Shahd. And that resisting all forms of occupation and extraction over Adivasi ancestral homelands is nation building. And that is firmly with this belief and believing in the dream and not calling it wasted romanticism is also solidarity. When I read the concept note, you're talking about state narratives. I think the state narratives that the privileged know, that what is good, that what is good for the oppressed uh, is what gets decided by the privileged people, and we need to call it a violence. This whole state narrative that is decided by the people is also a form of violence, but we do not really still call it as it is, that it is violence. And first and foremost, we actually need to engage in dismantling and throwing out this idea of development. I think it's the most genocidal, violent word that has devastated communities, generations, nations, and plundered Adivasi homelands, indigenous peoples, whether it's Palestine, whether it's Philippines, whether it's Bastar. And we have to also acknowledge and reestablish the idea that the indigenous peoples, the Adivasi people, can and must define their own paths for the future. And that when we talk of development, we actually assume a very linear history where we are actually very silently acknowledging that the Adivasi people, whatever they had and whatever they still have, is of little value, so they need to develop. And it's in this fact is like that development, that this model of development which has been deliberate and violent has destroyed Adivasi communities. And like I said before, this I feel is the genesis of this modern Indian nation state. It has been built on the violence, on the destruction of Adivasi and indigenous Mulvasi, Bahujan communities. And the idea of development is so antithetical to the Adivasi worldview, where it exists in a cycle of life, death, and life. whereas development is an extremely linear, idea of growth. And for justifying this idea of development or this idea of growth, militarization, like Shahad again pointed out very beautifully, that gradually militarization has become a defining character of the modern nation states. And because without force, these nation states cannot sustain. They cannot sustain, if they build their governance on democracy. And therefore, they bring in the armed police, the paramilitary, all the military apparatuses, drones, drone-aided bombings, sophisticated long-range guns, etc., like they've been doing in Bastar, as this is the only way today that they know how to govern. And one of the absolute compelling illustrations of how this military industrial political complex works, which I have literally see, is and it works to legitimize and justify state violence, is the case of this bauxite wars that have been raging in southern Odisha, which I believe holds around 40 to 60% of India's bauxite reserves. So Adani has this defense industry. Adani wants to produce weapons. Vedanta wants to export aluminium. Utkal Aluminium or Aditya Birla, wants to expand its refineries and smelters, because bauxite today fetches the highest price in the metal exchange, in the global metal exchange. It's the most sought after mineral today, and it's sought after because of the wars. So it's a vicious, violent cycle that companies produce weapons. The most uh, like the most preferred material for the arms and weapon industry is bauxite, because it's light, and it's very resilient. And so, what they do is they force the government to deploy militarization so as to put down any resistance to the occupation of Adivasi lands for their bauxite mining projects. And how does this everyday militarization experience for Adivasi communities is that there is heightened surveillance. Every day drones are flying over the villages, observing everything. Women have repeatedly complained to us that in the river region, in along the rivers where communities actually go to bathe and to uh, go to the nature's call, they also fly drones in those areas. But this whole constant hovering of the drone around your communities on your every day from 9 to 5 is so intimidating. Then there's slap breach of peace summons. Every time there is a meeting, there is a gathering, prior to the meeting, breach of peace summons are being slapped on all leaders, on organizations, and disproportionate force is used to actually simply just serve these summons or serve the arrest warrants. Uh, a huge army of 200 people flag march into a village to post 3 arrest warrants on the walls of 3 leaders. I mean, this is the optic terrorizing that is happening in Adivasi areas that are resisting bauxite mining, which is the number one material for arms industries, which Vedanta and Adani are sending to Palestine, to Philippines, to other regions where wars are happening, and also using in their own nations within Bastar, in occupied Kashmir, in the northeast, and now in Odisha. The other is that you terrorize a region by filing numerous fabricated false cases. So what we see is in the last 3 years in Tijmali, which is now at the heart of a lot of a raging war against Vedanta, in the last 3 years, 37 FIRs have been filed, and there are like what, when we see the complainants, when we analyze the complainants, we see that they are stock complainants. There are X number of people who are complainants for every case after every incident. So you have stock FIRs, stock complainants, and stock witnesses, all set up and organized by the police and in nexus with the company officials, ready to criminalize any form of dissent. And the other is the all these arrest warrants and these breach of peace summons use words like habitual offenders, social delinquents, to portray the Adivasi people, leaders who have a rightful right to dissent, have a rightful right to protest against the occupation of their lands, against extractive mining industries. But this is how you create a whole narrative, like Shahd was saying about, every Palestinian resistance is akin to terrorism. Similarly, every dissent, every protest in Adivasi region is seen as habitual offenders, as social delinquents. And so you create a whole narrative around who these people are, so that when you file a false FIR, that FIR seems justified, seems legitimate. And every organization that comes up, self organizes itself to protest, is seen as an anti-development, violent organization that is here to destroy the peace, law, and order of the region, for whatever that means. Hence, wars and weapons drive the greed for bauxite mining, and it is these Adivasi homelands that are sacrificed for genocidal wars, whether it's Kashmir, whether it's Palestine, whether it's Philippines, whether it's Bastar, in every Adivasi heartland. In fact, I am actually, when we talk of peace and development, I'm actually reminded of the times of the Tamil Eelam War of 4 from 2000, in 2009, which, by the way, was also a very similar Trumpian kind of a moment where, it was the last solution kind of thing for the Tamil Eelam fighters versus the Sinhala dominated Sri Lanka. One narrator actually wrote in one of the articles that I read that what was lost with the decimation of the LTT and other Tamil Eelam freedom fighting movements and groups was a counter narrative, and a counter narrative of what the state, the genocide of the Sri Lankan state or the Sinhala state was doing to the Tamil people. And the silencing of the voices of the Tamil Eelam liberation movements was a loss that we, perhaps as solidarity workers, we must not let happen. We cannot allow a counter narrative to be put down, to be silenced or wished away, a narrative that has been shaking the power corridors of this genocidal nation state, a narrative that has exposed the violence and the structural injustices that are today the fulcrum of this nation state. And I feel that Operation Kagar by the Modi Shah government was an attempt to wipe out this counter narrative. Other than the killing of or the martyring of thousands of Maoist cadres, it was also a way to silence the counter narrative that was coming from Adivasi communities who had become politically conscious, who had experienced war for 3 generations now and knew what war was, what meant to be in a low conflict, low, what the state calls low intensity conflict zone. And so we can, unlike the Tamil Eelam, the Operation Kagar has actually failed to kill the counter narratives. And those who have been following protests in Bailadila for saving Metaguda, or deposit number 4, as the state wishes to call it, will know what I am saying. Closer home, we have Tijmali's Ma Mati Mali Surakhya Mancha, Raigada and Kolahandi. We have the 5th Schedule Union in Lanjiberna in Sundargarh. And we have many more such resistance movements which are led by, which are creating people led narratives that emerge from the same political consciousness, and these are countering the lies of the Indian nation state. So peace and development are just eyewashes for violence and land occupation. Very often, actually, as you know, as the solidarity workers, we also tend to operate from a very colonial position, that people do not know, that they cannot decide. And it is in these contested regions that we have to be far more alert, vigilant, and conscious. Because every encounter with Adivasi resistance leaders tells us that they know, they can lead, they can decide, and they can fight back. The only point, perhaps, of contention that I see is that they do not know the ways of the violent nation state. And so the state always wants to shift the battleground to the courts, to the administrative paraphernalia, that is run by corporate money power, because that's the terrain in which the Adivasi communities are not, because that's your colonial administration, that's your colonial neo-colonial state, that's your law, your courts, your media, your administration. You want to fight an equal battle, fight it in the homelands of the Adivasi communities. Fight it on their ground. Then we shall see. With this unequal balance of power, we say that the Adivasi people cannot fight, cannot decide, do not know. Obviously, they do not know what the state has created, but they know what they have created, what they have nurtured, what they have cared for generations now. But the Adivasi people, actually, from my last 25 years of working with communities, is that while they have kept their resistance alive on their home grounds, but they have also now tactfully but slowly learned to fight the state on its grounds as well. Whether it's the courts, whether it's with the bureaucracy, whether it's with the red tape, they are learning. So it's a power that is growing in their home grounds, as well as now learning to negotiate the state on its own grounds. Therefore, when we see them questioning, settler colonialism or internal colonialism, when they speak of land inequalities, like the case of Malkangiri, when the Koya people actually organized and rose against in rage against 3 decades of oppression by non-Adivasi settlers who had come post the 1965 war, or when the Kondos of Koraput fought to reclaim their ancestral lands and forests that had been grabbed in lieu of liquor debts and intergenerational bondage by the non-Adivasi feudal landlords. It is in these instances that we realize that Adivasi communities understand settler colonialism and are willing to challenge it, not just the mining and the extraction, but also the internal colonialism. Very often, we do not recognize the intelligence of communities to understand settler colonialism. We think it's a very academic thing that can be only debated, but it's a lived reality that realized communities very well understand. Like the word Diku in Jharkhand is actually a reflection of the political understanding of occupation. So therefore, I feel that upholding the rights to self determination, autonomy, liberation, and sovereignty is at the heart of every resistance, Adivasi resistance, whether it's against extractive mining projects, like I've said before, or the illegal occupation of their forests in the name of conservation. Like, the Kolhos, the Mundas, the Lodhas, the Khadiyas of Simlipal in Mayurbhanj district of Odisha are, have been fighting for almost 20 years now against their illegal eviction and forced relocation using false solutions of wildlife and forest conservation. Or the Jainakurubas, Betakurubas, Panyas of Nagarhole, who have been relentlessly fighting actually to establish their legal right to return and their right to habitat governance. And this is proof that whenever the state attempts to actually extract and occupy Adivasi territories, they will face resistance, because the people have one clear message, and that either you respect their existence, or you have to expect the resistance. So when the state cannot put down Adivasi resistance, what it does, it tries to dry out the other sources of its sustenance. and one of which is the urban solidarity networks. But I really think that how long can they play this game? That either you kill them from inside or you kill the other sources that support them. And therefore, I really very strongly feel that if they can globalize their terror, their violence, their wars, their genocide, why can't we globalize our resistance? Why can't we ensure that there are multiple layers of solidarity networks, so that when one is down, and trying to gain back its feet, there are others who come in place, who get activated. And so the Adivasi communities have been resisting relentlessly, consistently, with courage and power. Where is the solidarity networks that actually sometimes just wither away, because we have not really learned to organize our solidarity work on the ethics, values, worldviews that the Adivasi communities continue to resist. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sharanya. I think, yeah, absolutely. Again, following from Shahad to you, you have certainly linked the global with the local. And on that note, I'll bring in our third speaker, Clifton. Um, Clifton, thank you so much again for being with us today. You have extensive experience as a lawyer and advocate representing workers in the fight for their labor rights, often against the brutal caste and class repression that arise from the same supremacist ways of marginalizing dissenting communities as is inflicted on the Adivasi peoples, as Sharanya talked. You have also been speaking out against Operation Kagar. So over to you, and we will be very grateful to hear from you now. Thank you.
Hi, Latika. Yeah, thanks. Also, I think by virtue of many years of work in Adivasi areas before I became a lawyer, and also work that one continues to do with Adivasi communities in Karnataka and South India. I'm approaching this from a little different kind of a standpoint, in the sense that looking at, say, resistance per se, uh, especially within the Indian context and within the Indian fascist context, that's probably how I would locate it. But of course, given the kind of the scale of this country, the population, it's obvious, that the kind of resistances that are happening are myriad and extremely crucial kind of resistances. A lot of them one can, be a bit dismissive as being non-revolutionary, too localized, so on and so forth. But the resistance to those people are fundamental to their existence. So, I think while talking today, I would definitely want to acknowledge that even as we speak, the kind of resistances that are happening by Adivasi communities against various so-called development projects, or whether it is, state-sanctioned corporate loot of natural resources, or even say conservation related projects like tourism, so on and so forth. And I think bearing in mind that those resistances are facing severe repression. I remember, I think for the past 15 days or so now, there's this project called the Ken Batwa. It's a river linking project in Madhya Pradesh, where Adivasis have been and led by women in large numbers, protesting against the forcible eviction that's been, that the government wants for them. There's also been so many other protests happening in my own state of where I come from, Karnataka. The kind of protest that one sees, it's really, I think it's also important that these protests are happening from the people's point of view, in the sense that that you're not giving in to the kind of subjugation that the state is trying to force on you. So with this in mind, there are basically really 3 4 points that I want to make. I'm really not going to take too much of time. I think one of the things that when we talk about the Adivasi community, I don't know if this was covered. I mean, I did go through some of your sessions, but the Adivasi community is not an homogeneous community in in India. It's really huge, and I think from what I have read, what I've heard in your sessions, you're primarily focusing on central India. You're looking at Odisha. You're looking at the so-called mineral-rich kind of regions. But if you were to look at if just go beyond that, say for instance, just one state away, say if you go to Maharashtra, if you go to Madhya Pradesh, if you go to Gujarat, you go to Rajasthan, you look at or you even come south, say to Telangana, to Andhra, to Karnataka, the issues that the Adivasi communities are facing over there may not be, the Adani Ambanis may not be involved over there, but the kind of survival crisis that they are facing is something that we really cannot lose track of. And of course, then if you go to the Northeast, it's an entirely different ballgame altogether over there. Of course, there it's also a very convoluted kind of a politics that's also being played out there. But I'm really not getting into that. But I just want to flag this, for us to, when we're talking about Adivasi, I think we should not lose track that we are talking at this point in time about a particular section of Adivasis in a particular part of India. The second thing I really wanted to talk about was the I believe at this point in time what's happening, while we obviously recognize the kind of the corporate, the kind of the economic side to the dispossession of Adivasis. There is also another aspect to it, and I think if you look at the current Indian regime, the party that rules, that has the government, which holds the political power, it basically is the front of another organization, which is the RSS, which draws its inspiration from Zionists. And Herzl was one of the people that, in that sense, actually kind of influenced this kind of a very religious majoritarian kind of a organization. Now, that organization is 100 years old in this country, and that organization today holds political power. That organization has an extremely clear understanding of who Adivasis are, and that battle is being fought today. And my fear is that we don't tend to give too much of an importance to that battle. And I would really, like to draw caution here that missing that is going to create a situation that's actually existing in Bastar at this point, which I will talk about at the end. So, what is this entire thing? So, Adivasis, the entire phrase Adivasis, I mean, for people who don't know, basically it is the original inhabitants. Adi being original, Vasi being the inhabitants. So, the original inhabitants of the land. Now, this is a very political articulation. It's a political articulation that negates a colonial identification of tribals, basically, primitive, backward kind of communities, which is by tribal, or the constitutional characterization of scheduled tribes. So Adivasi as a phrase, it's not just a cultural term. It's a very, very powerful articulation of who Adivasis are. This entire thing of being the original inhabitants in this. Now, this phrase has come in for, if you look at it at the level of governance, has come in for serious contestation. Most people will know that you have these indigenous and tribal population conventions that under the ILO, basically international instruments. So there's ILO 107 and there's ILO 169. ILO 107 obviously predates 169. India is a signatory to ILO 107, but when 169 came, which again provided greater protections for Adivasis against this kind of corporate loot, against this kinds of conservation projects, the entire thing of sovereignty over their land, so on and so forth. The Indian state has refused to ratify that solely on the ground that this entire questioning as to whether Adivasi is the correct phrase. But when you come to the RSS, I mean, it's a very obvious thing. They don't even agree with this. They use the phrase Vanvasi. Vanvasi basically means forest dweller. So for them, the Adivasi, when you say Adivasi, them being original inhabitants, then it means that they'll have to accept the entire Aryan invasion kind of a theory. They'll have to accept that the Vedic civilization, the Hindu culture that they claim to be original, is actually something that came in from outside. So this doesn't just end here. So if you look at the kind of work that the Sangh Parivar, the RSS, has been doing, it's been very determined work that they're doing, and the project is very simple. They believe that the project is the assimilation of Adivasis into the Hindu mainstream. What you can call, say, Hinduization of the Adivasis, what I would like to call the Hindutvaization of the Adivasis. And for this, there are organizations that are set up. This is extremely brilliant article that came out in Caravan a couple of months ago. that tracks around 2,500 organizations of the Sangh Parivar, of the RSS, that works in various sections of society. And you'd find that a large number of them are actually working in tribal areas, in Adivasi areas, with the sole kind of task of ensuring that the communities, these Adivasi communities, are Hindu in their sense. Now, there's another thing that they're doing simultaneously. So while you have this entire project of assimilation, you also have the mobilization of Adivasis in an anti-Muslim kind of a project. Now, this is something that we saw in Gujarat for many, many years now. From the protest, you look at the kind of targeting of Christian Adivasis that happened in Dangs, and then the Muslims in Godhra. So the project itself is not just of some kind of banal kind of Hinduization. It is this Hindutvaization. It's about creating this force against any other articulation of Adivasi sovereignty within those communities. And that is something that I think that we really need to really keep in mind. So when we talk about this entire assault of capitalism, this erasure of Adivasi identities and ways of being, worldviews, as it were, by these kinds of economic policies, these very same are also under challenge by the kind of cultural hegemony that the RSS and the what's that the Sangh Parivar is trying to bring in. I don't know if many people know this, but in Bastar, one of the things that's been happening parallelly with Kagar is also been a very determined and orchestrated violence against Christians, Adivasis who have converted to Christianity. Now, this is again a very sensitive subject, because working with Adivasi communities for so many years, I know that this is a subject that when you talk to Adivasis, what is it that you think about somebody who converts to some other religion? It's a very tense kind of a conversation, which I'm not going to get into. But the fact is that you do have a large number of Adivasis who follow Christianity. In Jharkhand, they've been doing it for hundreds of years. In some other places, maybe for lesser years. But now in Bastar, you have Christians who've been driven out of their villages, not just being driven out. Their graves are being exhumed and they've been told that you take your dead bodies away from here. You don't have the right to live here. So there was a case that's been filed in the Supreme Court, which is pending as of now. And on 18th of February 2026, that's a couple of months ago, the Supreme Court passed this order. It's a two-line order. The order says, in the meantime, it is provided that no further exhumation of the buried bodies shall be permitted. Now, I think, these realities as things that we cannot turn away from, in terms of how the Adivasi communities, while they're also in the sense, the victims of this entire economic assault, but they're also the target about all of this, this kind of a cultural hegemony of the RSS. So I really like us, to bear that in mind. Now, Bastar, of course, in central India, we've been talking about Kagar, and as anybody who believes in any form of civil liberties or any form of human rights, this is something that is totally unacceptable. What you've seen over the past year, and I think this has been spoken about at length, is basically a bloodthirsty and a vengeful Indian state which has made killing its aim, not defeat, not capture. It's about an obliteration of an entire section of people over there, which is what is happening in the name of Kagar. And our Home Minister had declared, that by March 31st of this year, Bastar, this India will be made a Naxal-free ring. But just to also tell you that this is again, one in a long kind of series of violence that has been brought upon the people of Central India in the name of fighting Maoists. You had the Janjagran Abhiyan, which happened in the 1990s. You had the Salvajudum in the 2005. Then you had the Operation Green Hunt under the previous Congress regime, and now you have Operation Kagar. I just summarized this into 6 points as to what Operation Kagar is all about. I must tell you, this Kagar is an Hindi word. I'm not too sure what it really means. People from South India find it very difficult nowadays, because most of the phrases in Indian governance is, Sanskrit or Hindi. But Kagar, I think, means push to some end or something. It pushed. That's what it probably means. But basically, this is the final push. That's the operation against the Maoists. the way I'd summarize is this, that Operation Kagar, it's basically just in the name of tackling Maoists, it's a war that is being waged on Adivasis. That's an unmistakable characteristic of it. Secondly, it is marked by state lawlessness and extrajudicial murder, because that's what is taking place. There's an incentive to kill in this, insofar as, bounty money being offered. It's militarization with camps, a huge amount of forces over there, and of course, corporate plans. But for me, I think, what really is something that I find very disturbing is the delegitimization of a political ideology, is what it attempts. Now, Maoist people can have differences with. I personally probably would have differences with them as well. You could have differences, and I think that it's fine to have differences. But this kind of an delegitimization of a political ideology, delegitimization of a particular form of resistance, that is something. And in this way, in this manner of using, your forces, using this kind of violence, brutal violence, and that is something that is unacceptable and should be unacceptable, I would imagine, to any democratic loving person in this country. I'm not saying, that one has to romanticize Maoists, but I'm saying that you don't even have to demonize them. You cannot treat them in this fashion. And no one expects, it's as much as, one doesn't expect the ruling class or the Maoists to give up their politics. That's at this point in time, that's really not required. What you require at this point is, and what is something that we've been saying, is that there has to be a ceasefire. There has to be talks. It has to be done in a democratic fashion. There was an organization called the Mulvasi Bachao Manch, which is it was an open organization against the camps over there. Democratic functioning, democratic protests, they were banned, unnecessarily banned. So these kinds of steps were something that, we as civil society, we kept saying that this is something that you should stop. And there are a couple of friends over here who were part of those efforts that, that all of us had made. But unfortunately, it is a fascist regime at this point, and we are that kind of a phase in society in India at this point. So inevitably, the Indian state did not listen, and what we have now is on 30th of March, just this year, the Home Minister in Parliament declaring that this is the end. That Naxal-free India is one of the biggest successes of the uh, of the Indian government. But I think, this kind of betrays it betrays a kind of ignorance of history. Because the Naxalite movement, if you look at in India, I mean, I belong to one stream of the Naxalite movement. It is an irrepressible force in this country, because as long as you have the kind of oppression, the kind of injustice in this country, people will keep finding forms to struggle it. And you can name one of it Naxalism, you can call the Maoism, you can give it whatever name you want. But the fact is that it will be the resistance of the people. And what we are seeing now, and I must also, sorry if I'm taking too much time, I'll just take a couple of minutes more. Just as we speak, I mean, it's like a peak moment also for working class struggles. So over the last 2 months, you've had working class struggles that are broken out all across North India. Generally, something that you don't expect. And the interesting thing is this. Right now, there's been more than 353 arrests of workers, innumerable number of FIRs, criminal cases that have been lodged. Most of the workers' families do not know where their loved one is. They don't know which police station that person is held in. They don't know if that person has been remanded to judicial custody. If so, which jail that person is. They don't know under which FIR which criminal case that person has been arrested. They don't even know where to go to apply for bail. And the organization that I belong to, and of course, many other democratic minded lawyers are all trying to help out in this entire process in Delhi. But one of the interesting things is this. The moment these protests broke out, and it was massive, especially in Uttar Pradesh, you had you had the chief minister, from the chief minister to the to various ministers, blaming various people. Of course, the bogey of Pakistan has to come up, so one of them did blame Pakistan, but the chief minister actually said that Naxalism is again raising its head over here. Now, of course, it really it then proves the home minister was totally wrong. If he declared on 30th of March that Naxalism is dead in India, and then the BJP chief minister 2 weeks later declares that no, very well, Naxalism is the cause for working class struggles, then somebody is lying over there. But I think that's not what I'll take away from that. What I take away from that is the is the demonization of any form of resistance. Now, like I keep saying this is a fascist regime. They cannot tolerate any difference of opinion. They cannot tolerate any kind of dissent, any kind of resistance, any kind of a protest, and they'll do anything to clamp down on that. And of course, one of the easiest things to do is to say that these are all urban Naxals, and that's the one of the ways in which they're trying to demonize the entire working class struggles. It would have been fine if this is something that they were just saying, and it was nothing beyond that. But they're actually going beyond that now. So BJP ruled, no, in a BJP ruled state of Maharashtra, in July last year, they passed a law which is called the Maharashtra Special Public Security Bill. The bill is explicitly passed. This law has been enacted explicitly to deal with the concept of quote unquote urban Naxals. So the statement of objections reasons of the bill states that this new law is required to stop the menace of Naxalism and counter the activities of Naxal organizations or similar organizations through the United Front that are creating unrest among common masses to propagate their ideology of armed rebellion against constitutional mandate and disrupts public order in the state. So the bill, if you look at it, there are four main aspects of this bill that I want you to keep in mind. So firstly, under this bill, any persons who are members or even not members, but associated with some organization which is doing, which they claim to be a Naxal front, they are liable to be punished. The authorities, the district authorities, have the power to notify any place as being a place that is used for such kind of activities, and immediate possession of that place can be taken by the government. Not only that, whatever monies, securities, all of the assets that are found in that space, that will be forfeited to the government. The good thing is that this is not yet it's not yet received the assent of the governor, which means that it's not yet come into force. But this is the thinking that the BJP is developing in the country at this point, and it won't be a surprise if all of this is something that you find. If you find all other states which are ruled by the BJP coming up with such kind of a law. So what I'd like to end with is saying is that all across the country, whether it's Kashmir, if you look at the manner in which Article 370 was abrogated, the manner in which people were jailed over there. A bunch of us, we actually did a very detailed fact finding at that time. We went there a couple of weeks after Article 370 was abrogated, and we went to many districts of Kashmir. It's a report called Imprisoned Resistance, and if you can, please do find it and read it. But the manner in which the brute force of the state is used to clamp down any kind of dissent, I think is something that we're seeing all around. Somebody like Umar Khalid and Sharji Liman are still in jail. Many other young Muslim activists are still in jail. Thousands of Adivasi activists are still in jail in various other parts of the country. And in fact, at this juncture, no one is safe in this country. You have probably, I'm not sure if this is something that's happened many times before, but two sitting chief ministers were sent to jail by this regime. So in this kind of a situation, I think really the question is, what does one do? And here I really something that I've been saying for so many years, and I really was so glad to hear Shahd also say it, that whatever reaches a peak, it must decline, and the darkest moments are always before a dawn. And somehow we believe that these forces are so irresistible, these forces are so inevitable, and then we forget that history teaches us otherwise. History is of change. It's all it's about the onward march towards rights. It's onward march towards a better society, an onward march towards a better, humanity. And I think all of us are there in that journey together. We'll have our differences, but I think ultimately at this point, if one were to ask me, in this situation, what is the solidarity that you want? I'd like a solidarity that's genuine, that's open to some amount of differences, that's willing to be honest, transparent. At the end of the day, to know that at least these fascist forces that we want to fight can only be defeated if we all unite. And defeating a fascist force here, of course, will give us the strength to And like the strength that we get from the Palestine solidarity movements in the US, for instance, the students and the encampments, outstanding protests by them. Of course, we are inspired by the resistance in Palestine, but we're also inspired by the resistance of the solidarity activists itself. And I think, these are the things that we need to kind of draw on. So I'll stop here. I'm sorry if I took too much of time. Thank you.
No, no, thank you so much, Clifton. None of you took too much time, I think. This was a really important conversation, and we have comments in the chat reflecting that. So thank you so much. And but I am also conscious that time is passing. And very quickly, if we can take a few of the questions which were in the chat, it will be really good. So Shahd, I'll come back to you because this will also mean you have a chance to maybe quickly just comment on what you've heard from our two speakers in India. The questions were that could Shahd explain the concept of self-determination of people as opposed to self-determination of nations? And could you also comment on this question of divisions being fomented between the oppressed community? How big a danger is it for Palestinian people? Because this is very relevant to what Clifton and Sharanya have been also talking about in terms of building solidarity in India. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the speakers. This was indeed a very strong learning experience, and it is. And perhaps at this moment when we're capable of seeing all of these conjunctions come, with the narratives that are being told are so familiar. And it's as if I've heard these stories over and over again. And with that, again, the idea that we are really capable of seeing ways that bring us in together. And perhaps I'll start with answering the second bit in relation to division and fragmentation, which is indeed one of the biggest problems that we have, which is that we can talk about liberation, we can articulate it ourselves. Those who are directly under the fire of oppression have a very clear perception of how oppression acts and behaves. And perhaps, as Sharanya was saying, that understanding the tools and trying to adapt to these different tools. However, once you step just a little bit further away from the gun, you would see and realize and you're more susceptible to a distortion of perception, which comes again to the other role that is being played here by the laws, as well as the state narratives in maintaining even fragmentation among the oppressed people. So, for example, with us now, it becomes very much like I call them deflecting tactics or deflecting narratives. Or, for example, when I come and say I stand with the people of Lebanon, and then that would be said, oh, so you are for Hezbollah. Or if you say, especially this is with Iran, if you say, and I am against the bombing of a sovereign state, so you're with the Islamic State, which are indeed seeds of fragmentation that indeed facilitate the distortion of the front of the narrative. And here we must be very careful when we look at those seeds of fragmentation in actually how is it that we imagine the day after. Because with an oppressive state like India, with a colonizing entity like Israel, what they will do is, if the resistance becomes too unmanageable, they will offer us half solutions that will take away the rights of the future generations, and so further fragmentation amongst us, thereby giving us, negotiating with us solutions that are not justiciable, but rather halfway through, and in that way sowing fragmentation amongst us, in that the people who are seeking justice or are holding on to justice are seen as the quote unquote radicals, or asking for too much, or obsessed with too much. And these are the types of narratives that we should be very clear in articulating, as in anything that is less than that is less than our rights in their full comprehension inevitably steals away from the next generation's rights. And that's I myself have had my own rights stolen by the peace agreements with Israel, for example, right before I was born, or the Oslo Accords, or all of these halfway solutions. Secondly, in relation to the self-determination of people versus states, that's a very interesting part. So like colonial erasure and like the way that the narratives of the people who are colonized or under oppression are not only untold and sidelined, as we were reminded by Sharanya's narration, is that also the laws that they've worked hard to develop. And the idea of the self-determination of peoples is sadly very much marginalized in international legal scholarship. And as you can imagine, it's one of the most conservative, as well as you would call it, like, very racially oriented disciplines in the world. Here again, I would refer to very constitutive works in the 1960s and 70s that sought to understand how is it that also and sought to challenge, let's say, the violence that comes with the nation state. And sadly enough, at that time, the development of this notion was also put back by the Soviet Union itself, because that wasn't in the favor of the Soviet Union. So that died. But works like the works of the Tricontinental Conference in the 1960s, which was a coalition of resistance movements, sought to bring back that notion and that understanding of seeking to kind of critique the limitations that were put forward by the very colonial understanding of what a state is. And as we could see, that colonial understanding has been built on the creation of enemies who are the internal people against which genocides are created. So going forward, it must be really articulated. And here we would build on the literature by indigenous peoples. And here I'm looking at a lot of the literature that was developed in the Australian context that really seeks to give, to argue for the importance of a strong articulation of that. Lastly, in relation to commentary, one thing that really came to mind is the idea that there is a part of the decline that we are seeing in the global order is itself also comes hand in hand with this pivot towards militarization, in the sense that the core states as well as the elite realize that the power over production in this world has shifted actually, and it's more towards the global majority. By that I mean that like the core of the production that globalization relies on is no longer centered in the global north or in core states, but rather elsewhere. What they have is military. What they have is the power to coerce. And in a war, you have multiple tools of coercion. First and foremost, of course, is the military forms of predation or coercion, but also then there are the other tools or the capacity to navigate laws. So we are seeing a steep rise of militarization and a focus on also the reintegration of the private sector into the military sector, as we see, for example, now with the tech industry in the US, as we see, of course, with India as well, whereby we have this very close corporate state relationship, which really asks and poses the question that perhaps at the core of our struggle also should be this challenge for the public-private divide, should be this challenge for the corporate form. And here we must recall efforts that go along the line of the fact that corporations must respect the right of self-determination. And these were calls that were actually put forward by people like Salvador Allende, who was killed for calling for such frameworks. And it is taking it hat to hat with not just the government but also the elite, and putting a picture on the elite that is facing this. So for example, here in England we have a dinner for arms corporations for arms corporations every year that happens in central London. And one of the primary things that activists do is to actually just go in front of that dinner and more or less do the stare game, where we're just shouting shame, shame as they enter for their really fancy dinner with their dresses. But to actually start to articulate that, and perhaps that way of thinking also, like, making it clear, putting in the political economic language into the hands of the working class is very important, because the seeds of fragmentation that are sown amongst us are seeds of political identity. And if we recognize that our struggles are not those in relation to who are you and who am I, instead of struggles that are focused on a core value of the negation of any human's rights to subordinate and subjugate another human, specifically on a collective level, then perhaps we're able to start to, get the gears and tools, because that's not the language that they're speaking. That's not the way that they want us to think. They don't want us to see that the problem is Adani and Tata, and they want to relegate us only to the form of seeing this as the state. And last but not least, of course, and this has been quite noted by my fellow panelists, is indeed we don't only see this interconnection of struggles on the abstract level, but we see it on the material level, in the deep connection between the fascist logic and tendencies that are taken forward by the Indian regime, as well as the Zionist regime, and their deep interconnections together along the sides of militarization. And also, not only that, the normalization of a racialized tone in it. When the Israelis describe the Indians as factories for the creation of weapons, and they're like, you cannot bomb us or affect us because we're able to buy Indian people at cheap price, as being sold by their elite, and as kindly noted as well, being capable of even dispossessing and displacing their people for taking the natural resources to fund our own expansion of capital. And that, I think, is kind of, if we're able to focus, and going back to the primary theme of this meeting, which is in relation to narratives, if we're able to push in capturing how is it that we counter those narratives, those narration lines, in a way that stop these seeds of fragmentation, and find ways to popularize that and share that specifically with the people on the front lines and with the people who stand in solidarity with them, we have a much higher chance of uniting our voices, which indeed is the only way that we can survive, unless we are if we are united and capable of looking at each other in the eye and understanding each other's struggles at their core.
Thank you so much, and absolute time to do that. As you said, a very critical time. We have an opportunity as well. If the elite saw that some moments were opportunistic moments to finish off long-standing problems, then we also have that opportunity to come together now, and that's what we will take away from this and build on. So thank you so much. I am conscious we finished 1.5 hours. There were a few more questions, so I would like to pose one question to Sharanya and Clifton together, if that's okay, and then we'll end after that. So this was a question which was on PESA, and I'll leave it to you to give the full form, if that's okay, both of you. But the question was, where is it? Sorry, just a moment. Yeah, is the traditional governance system backed by PESA still alive? Is it possible to revive and rejuvenate tribal self-governance for their self-rule, at least for the village and cluster levels, on matters related to natural resource management, forest, water, and legal land? But I would actually like to extend this question to say what this means for us also. So it is not just about reviving it for the Adivasis in their land, but what does it also mean for us? Yeah, Sharanya and Clifton, if both of you could bring in points, maybe yes, Sharanya first. Thank you.
Thank you. So PESA is this 1996 Act, which is the Panchayat Extension to Scheduled Areas Act, which basically came because the Gram Panchayat Act did not recognize that there are regions that are dominated, or it's the habitat of Adivasi communities, and that there is a need for a different kind of a self-governance framework. So it comes from the 5th schedule of the Indian Constitution, which talks about self-governance and rights of communities to live by their own customs and traditions. So it flows from that. PESA, I mean, there are two, for as I see, PESA has two different two sides to it. When I see PESA in the context of, say, regulating development projects, making governments accountable for their welfare programs, for education, for health, then PESA is a strong act that gives the village councils or the Gram Sabha a lot of power to regulate what kind of educational curriculum can be implemented, what kind of health programs, what kind of employment generation programs, and so on and so forth. But in the so-called softer realms of governance, the real power that that runs the military industrial complex of the Indian government is like the production or the mineral, the mines and mineral production or the extraction. In that realm, PESA actually does not give the Gram Sabhas that level of power of deciding. It's PESA gives rights of regulating minor minerals, which is like sand, um, small granite for the tar for making tar roads, that kind of thing. But for major minerals, which is coal, iron ore, which are the real baddies, the real extractive, destructive mining projects that drive the industrial war economy, the PESA or the Gram Sabhas do not really have the power to decide or to consent. The other thing is that it does not talk of consent. PESA, as well as the Environment Impact Assessment Acts, they talk of consultation. And that's actually a watering down of the right of the, of the autonomy or the agency, recognizing the agency of communities to say no. But a lot of that has been compensated with the Forest Rights Act of 2006. But PESA still needs a lot more strengthening. And in Odisha, at least, the rules have not been formed. There have been two failed attempts at making the rules, but they were so bad and so anti people or anti Adivasi that the rules could not go through. So, because of the absence of rules, there are no operational guidelines. There is just PESA as an act, but to implement it, we do not have the tools of implementing PESA in Orissa. So this is my take. And therefore, the idea of self-governance or the idea of self-determination, I feel, is way beyond what the state kind of permits, driven by its own agendas, what the state permits. Communities have to start asserting their self-determination as how they understand their ancestral rights to their land and forests. Protective laws like PESA and the Scheduled Areas Transfer of Immovable Properties Act, or say the Forest Rights Act, can be used as tools. But when I feel that communities also have to, read, like define what they understand as their rights. Because sometimes I feel that, this is my experience, that how communities articulate as what are their rights is very different from the constitutional judicial definition of rights. And somewhere there, I see a contestation of the idea of ownership, belongingness, survival, land, memory. All of this does not have space within the laws, the courts, the judicial languages, or the colonial state language in which the states govern themselves. So, Clifton can
Yes.
definitely add a lot more.
See, any law, which is a product of, say, some struggle, there it has some elements of it that generally in a democratic state is useful. So even PESA, which came out in 1996, is a product of people's struggle. It's not the largesse of the Indian state that they, willy-nilly thought that let's give this law to Adivasis and suddenly, give them rights. It was preceded by decades of struggle. And the entire slogan that I remember we used to have is that "Hamare gaon mein hamara raj," that it will be our rule in our village. That was the slogan. And PESA was a kind of a legal formulation of that entire thing. And needless to add, uh, obviously the state is not going to let go that much, and so those shortcomings are there in that law. Also, the 2013, even if you look at, say, the 2006 Act, the Forest Rights Act, again, that is an act that is preceded by years and years of struggle. So, all of these acts, whatever progressive element they have in them, is because that they were preceded by the struggles. And of course, as with any other law, it is only the struggles that can sustain even their implementation. Now, for instance, if you look at PESA, any act, you have the statute and then you have the rules that are basically how to operationalize that entire statute. There are states that still do not even have the rules. So the act is there, it's on a shelf. You don't have the rules, which means that you don't even have the operational guidelines to actually put that into force. And one of the points that was made, which is very important, that PESA Act is traceable to the fifth schedule of the Constitution, under which scheduled areas are declared. Now, there's a long history to that. I'm not going to get into that. But just to give you a sense that there's at least that element of you're a scheduled area, you have PESA, so some element of some rights that Adivasis enjoy over there. There are a dozen states where you don't even have scheduled areas. There are no scheduled areas in the entire South India. West Bengal has no scheduled areas. The state refuses to declare these areas as scheduled areas, because then immediately PESA comes into force, and there is that kind of, their hands are tied to that extent. So I think, to that limited extent, these are acts that have some kind of relevance in that sense. But of course, like I said, it all depends on the protests. The only point I really wanted to respond to is also this entire thing of the say sovereignty of communities. I don't have this a very romantic notion of any community. Any community. I think any community, there are contestations. There is no homogeneous community in that sense. So even when you talk of Adivasi communities, one is to be, that okay, because I'm seeing this. Like, I'll give you an example. There are communities that our organization, Adivasi Sangharsh Morcha, we work with in Karnataka. These are communities that were thrown out of the forest maybe 150, 200 years ago. They now live literally in slave-like conditions in the coffee plantations of Kodugu. We've been organizing them to get them out of the coffee plantation, so that they can at least find some space of some freedom. But if you come out from the coffee plantations, you have no village. You don't have a home village. The notion of your native village does not exist for this community. So what you do, you find some government land, you go and pitch your tent over there, you capture that land, and then you fight and you ensure that the government gives that land to you. That's what is happening over there. But when we try to and we try to build solidarities between Adivasi communities from that same district who are living in the forest and these communities, some of the forest district communities will tell us that, see, why don't they come back to the forest and then we can all be happy? No, you don't build solidarities on those conditionalities. You can't. That is, not possible at all. And for these communities now, the way life in the forest is something that's totally alien to them, completely alien to them. For them, life is very different today. So I think even this notion, of who decides, to say the community decides. I think we need to be little, I would say that, we need to not be blind to the possibilities of exclusions, of subjugations that are also that are also happening and could possibly happen. But that does not take away from the fact that the autonomy that overall communities exercise, that should ever be clamped upon. I would draw a difference between the two.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I think that's a really good point to end this conversation on also, because absolutely, I mean, we know it that there is nothing like a huge, I mean, we have to build that huge solidarity. And like you yourself said it, and during your talk also, I mean, there can be differences. There can be differences in ideology between everything, but we have to now at this moment recognize that it's okay to have those differences, but we can still live together, as Shahd was saying, also about as humans next to each other despite our differences. So thank you, and yeah, I'll just bring this session to a close now. Thank you all for being with us today and supporting this series. And we are deeply, deeply grateful to our speakers. I just cannot thank you enough, really, for your critical insights into how civil society must respond to the present moment. I know that we cannot go away with some clear-cut answers, but certainly we have learned a lot as to how to proceed. It is a moment that is crucial not only for Adivasi resistance, but also for building and sustaining solidarities, as has been consistently emphasized by the movements on the ground, whether in Bastar or, as you said, Clifton, in the Adivasi regions itself, beyond those in the mineral-rich regions, right up to Palestine. What emerges clearly is the responsibility to continue connecting the dots and to challenge the narratives that seek to normalize state violence and repression while silencing dissent in the service of capital and its interest in all indigenous lands and resources, again from Bastar to Palestine. This series, I would like to again remind as I close, has never been intended merely as a space for information sharing. Bastar, as we have discussed today, is not an isolated region. It is a microcosm of a wider global struggle of indigenous peoples confronting dispossession carried out in the name of development. There is nothing like an exceptional struggle here. We hope that this series contributes to amplifying these voices and to bringing more people and organizations into meaningful solidarity with these struggles. There was plenty today that was discussed to get us started. We encourage you to stay connected with us, to continue amplifying this work, and to find ways wherever you are to organize and act in solidarity, as we have learned about it today. We will be announcing the final session of this series soon, but as I have been saying, it won't be the end, but rather the beginning of a much longer work of solidarity. So please stay tuned and follow us on social media. And thank you and good evening to you all, wherever you are. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a good evening.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Yeah.